The Apostle Paul was a man who didn't shy away from confrontation. As we read his letter to the Romans today on Things Above, Pastor John Durante points out that we should be confrontational at times as well.
The people in the church at Rome, he doesn't know. He's not sure. He's not the one that preached the gospel to them. So what does he do? He makes sure that everyone gets confronted. Confrontational speech. It's not something that our culture today welcomes. We shy away from confrontation. Folks, that is to our shame. We have lost the proper place of confrontation in our culture.
Many religions across the world have their fair share of traditions and rituals. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul said these traditions have a tendency to lure people into a false sense of security concerning their salvation. Paul explained that we're saved by grace, not by works. As we'll see today, this wasn't an easy pill to swallow for the religious people of Paul's day. Hello and welcome to Things Above with John Durante of Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. It's our pleasure to bring you another study from the book of Romans. Join us now in chapter 3 as Pastor John brings today's message.
What advantage then has the Jew, or what profit of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect? Absolutely not, certainly not. Indeed, let God be true, but every man a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? I speak as a man. Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? For if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, their condemnation is just. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin, as it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have altogether become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now verse 19 and 20. And now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. When we get into verse 1, we see that the question is being posed about the position of a Jew. We've gone back and forth to different people, identities in chapter 2. We actually saw that subject breached somewhat in chapter 1. But now we get into a place where it's speaking specifically about the Jew in verse 1, but it continues and then adds everybody back in later on throughout the rest of the chapter. But make no mistake, the subject matter is confrontation. That's what this is about. When Paul wrote this letter, I'll remind you, as I said last week, he did not write this to Galatia. He did not write this to Cappadocia. He did not write this to Colossae. He did not write this to Ephesus. He wrote this to the church in Rome, which was the only church that Paul wrote a letter to that he did not physically plant the church. As a result, he didn't know most of the people in that congregation. You see, the letters that he wrote to the other churches take on a completely different tenor or tone. He speaks personally to them as if he already knows their spiritual condition. The people in the church at Rome, he doesn't know. He's not sure. He's not the one that preached the gospel to them. So what does he do? He makes sure that everyone gets confronted. Confrontational speech. It's not something that our culture today welcomes. We shy away from confrontation. Folks, that is to our shame. We have lost the proper place of confrontation in our culture. I'm going to offer some explanations as to how or why that happened. We're all familiar with different generations in our own lifetimes. We have fun with these things. We have, most famously, the baby boomers, right? Made the generational observations popular. We have the before them, we have the traditionalists, or what was called the silent generation. Before that, we have the great generation. They were considered the great ones. But I'm going to go through these, and I want you to think through the changes that happened and how these definitions and the sort of the identity that these generations have taken upon themselves and what marks these generations, how the changes in our society and culture in our country have affected these people. And how that has translated eventually to a generation of people who does not like to or want to deal with confrontation. The traditionalist or silent generation are those, and by the way, these years and dates and identities are debatable. Some people say, oh, it's 1947, say it's 45, it's 40. I'm right smack dab in the middle as I've done research. The traditionalist or silent generation are those who were born before 1945. This generation was known for having strong moral convictions, believing that if they followed the rules and did things correctly, that they would ultimately or eventually succeed in life. They came into the world and grew up during a time when World War II was just being finished and over, and now they had nothing necessarily that they knew of that they could literally count on. There was nothing that was guaranteed in their life. There was nothing that was just, it's just always going to be there. No promise of permanency in their life. Everything was unknown as they looked forward to the future. They knew that if they were going to make it in this world, they had to work hard, and they believed that they had to do it the right way, or they were not going to be rewarded. Well, they eventually succeeded so quickly that our country, under their work ethic, became prosperous. And that led and opened the door to a way of thinking, well, we can relax. We have lots that we have to look forward to. Everything's going great. Let's go ahead and have babies. And economic prosperity led to fertility and prosperity in terms of harvesting a huge nation of people, which led to the baby boomers, known and named for a dramatic fertility and economic increases in our culture. Their characteristics change. They're known for being very self-assured, goal-centric, and perhaps, my suggestion, they were the beginning of an overconfidence in the world and in themselves. Their years, the baby boomers, 1946 through 1964. And then next comes my peeps. Who's after the baby boomers? Gen X. The generation that refuses to be called anything at all. Don't call us Gen X. 1965, arguably to 1976, got its name, maybe you didn't know this, from a novel in 1991 called Gen X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture. I know, I'm sure you all have copies of that sitting home, right? But the title of the book sort of speaks to the definition of the culture. We are life in the fast lane. Everything of the previous generation, just a lot more of it and much faster. Also called, who knows the other pet name for the Gen X folks? No? Well, I haven't heard that one. How about latchkey kids? You heard that one? Latchkey kids. Why? We're latchkey kids because during this time, we were getting more of it and we were getting it faster, but we decided, you know what? If we both go out into the workforce, We can double our efforts and make a lot more money and have a lot more stuff and provide even a better future for our kids. So the kids came home from school and were home by themselves until someone got home from work. Latchkey kids. A compromise was made there. A sacrifice was made, trading one thing for something else. This generation then gave birth to the next generation, which is millennials come next. The millennials, born right in or about 1977, all the way through to 1995. Their name was called millennials primarily because they're still growing up during the transformation or change into the 2000s. As a generation, they're often criticized for an extreme rise in what we phrase or call the entitlement mentality. Have you heard of that before, the entitlement mentality? Is it something that you observe and agree with that it actually exists? People just believing that they're just entitled to something. Oh, no, well, it's there. I should just have it. Everybody should just have it. That's a big departure from the traditionalist or silent generation. And then the millennials, by the way, then lead us into the current observable generation, which is called Gen Z, if you didn't know that, which I like that because my daughter's part of that generation, Zoe Z, and helps me remember it because I'm part of the Gen Xers, which means I often don't remember things, and that has to do with the way I grew up and the things that I did to my brain. Anyway, there's another name for the Gen Zers. They're also called iGen. Did you ever hear that one? Which to me, I like that better because me, myself, and I, they're very self-focused. And that's, by the way, the trinity of stupidity, if you've never heard that before. And by the way, like the Gen Xers, even more so, they are completely dependent on technology for everything. Aren't they? It's been said, perhaps you can identify with this, baby boomers dreamed up the VCR. Gen Xers taught them how to set the clock on the VCR. Millennials ignored the VCR, and iGens have no clue what a VCR is. Now, of course, we have fun with these things, but as you observe the transformation in our culture, what happens to a culture when it's exalted in prosperity is it changes dramatically. The more they have, the less they need. The less they need, the more they want.
That is so true, isn't it? We see people exactly like that all around us. You're listening to Things Above, the radio ministry of Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. Pastor John Durante will have the second half of today's message for us in just a few moments. We're just getting our feet wet with this radio ministry, and it would be so nice to hear from you here in the early going. If you appreciate the teaching of Pastor John, please let us know. And maybe you'd like to help with a financial gift. A good place to go is thingsaboveradio.com. Not only can you make a secure donation at thingsaboveradio.com, but there's also a place to leave your questions or comments for Pastor John. We hope to hear from you soon. Now here's Pastor John with the second half of our message.
You would think it would go the opposite way. It doesn't. And it hasn't. And what they think they need the least is your opinion about their morals. That's the culture that we live in today. And phrases and terms that have been used for other things in the past have important meaning to them, different than what it means to us. Let me shoot one at you. Political correctness has invaded our culture, permeated our culture, where people say, you shouldn't say that. That's not nice. That's not right. Really, it's a question of motive, not words. It's why you're saying what you say that matters, not the words themselves. But don't tell them that. There's another phrase, by the way, that has just permeated our culture today. It has been introduced through psychology and psychiatry and self-help books, which litter the shelves of the bookstores everywhere you go. You know what this phrase is? Self-esteem. Self-esteem. It has permeated our culture. People just automatically believe that it's important to believe in yourself. Believing in yourself is the worst possible enemy to reading the Bible. The Bible is a confrontational book, folks. It wants to tell you, it wants to say to you, you have a problem, you're a sinner. If you're one who's trying to build yourself up in self, you're not going to be all that willing to hear that you're a sinner. And by the way, that's not politically correct. So keep your Bible to yourself. And I'll just look at my technology and it'll tell me what I want to hear. I'm the iGen. I'm this, I'm that. Our culture is not willing to hear that it's in sin. When we get into chapter 3 of Romans, Paul's making an argument that that's what God is trying to say to us. We're sinners. We have to hear this. We have to listen. Now, before I continue any further, let me make something very clear. I'm not saying that because self-esteem is bad, that doesn't mean that you don't have value. Because you're saying, well, Pastor John, you're telling me that I'm a bad person, I'm not a good person. Yes, I am, but I am not saying that you have no value. In fact, just the opposite. The source of your value does not come from yourself. That's what I'm trying to say to you. You see, I'm just observing the value that God has placed on you. That's all I'm doing. I'm sitting here watching and seeing what God did because of how much He loves you. He valued you more than the life of His own Son. Do you hear what I'm saying? Are you valuable? Absolutely, more than you even think you are. Not because of who you are, but because of who Jesus is. God spent the most valuable thing there is on you. Yes, you're valuable, but you're not good. You're not a good person. Can good come from you? Absolutely. When the gospel thrives inside of you, when you live not for yourself, but for God, good comes from you. And you can store up and save up treasures in heaven. That's the context for Romans chapter 3. If you're not willing to be confronted, then you're not willing to walk with Jesus. You have to say, bring it on, Lord. I want to know what my sin is. I want to hear what you have to say about me. Whether I'm a Jew, whether I'm a Greek, whether I'm Roman, whether I'm Gentile, the moralist, which we talked about last week, the one who thinks that they're a good person because they do good things. They're all in view in chapter 3 as if for Paul to say, it doesn't matter what you think. God is right and you are wrong. Look at verse 1. He begins, as I said before, with the Jew and the point of view or the perspective of the Jew. Well, is there any advantage to being a Jew? Paul has a method of making an argument in Scripture. I don't know if you ever noticed this. This is especially poignant here in Romans. This is his primary method here. You ever heard the phrase setting up straw men? So if you're making an argument, legally speaking, you paint a certain picture of a person who is perhaps the argument against what you're trying to say, and then you tear the person down and make that person look foolish. Paul does that better than anyone, and he does it right here. Does the Jew have an advantage, as he goes on to say? Well, is there any profit to being born a Jew and having the outward sign of circumcision? He says, absolutely there is. Why? Well, mainly because to the Jews, to the circumcision, was committed the oracles of God. Now, that's not a word that we're all that common, we all use very commonly, is it? Oracle. In fact, you might think to yourself, well, isn't that like a person, an oracle? Because you probably watched The Matrix, and that just speaks to your generation, right? The word oracle literally means burden. The word oracle means burden. The prophets in the Old Testament were given the oracles of God. The nation Israel was given an advantage in that the burdens of God. Why would the law of God, why would the word of God in truth be considered a burden? Because it's confrontational. It confronts people. It tears them down before it builds them back up. It doesn't accept people right as they are. It first says you have a problem of sin that needs to be dealt with, and then seeks to build them back up in Christ. The oracles of God. Do the Jews have an advantage? Absolutely. They were given the truth. They had the truth. We have a familiarity with the concept of laws. Well, for example, we have the common law, which is presided over by human judges appointed by the government and hopefully enforced by police in most cases. The common law. We interact with the common law all the time. We have the moral law, which is established in culturally speaking, mutually understood, and so it's supposed to transcend culture, the moral law, but it doesn't. If it's rooted in humanity, it fails to transcend cultures. We can't even have moral law that transcends the culture of our different generations we've identified in the opening statement of the message. From one generation to the next, there's no consistency in moral law. We've failed in even that. That's crazy. So then there has to be something that we can look to and say that this is solid, something that transcends culture, that transcends time, that transcends everything, that is a firm thing that we could say, this is truth. That's why it's an oracle. Because it doesn't come from here, it comes from outside of here. The one who made us is the one who wrote it. Verse 3. Now, here comes the straw man argument. Maybe you're listening to Paul's debate here and you're thinking to yourself, what about this kind of a person? Paul's assuming that you might think that, so he's going to paint the picture of that person for you. He says, what if some did not believe? So, yeah, the Jews, they've been given the oracles of God, but what if in the face of all that advantage, they don't believe? Does that then mean, will their unbelief then make the faithfulness of God without effect? Well, okay, I understand the question. And, since God's people kind of state it this way, were unfaithful and unable to achieve a faith relationship with God through the law, does that then mean their unbelief makes God's faithfulness without effect? Wow. I think David answered this question best in Psalm 89, verses 30 through 37, so I'll let him speak to this. He said, if his sons forsake my law, God's words, my law, and do not walk in my judgments, my oracles, if they break my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with a rod and their iniquity with stripes. Nevertheless, my loving kindness I will not utterly take from him, nor allow my faithfulness to fail. God cannot fail. God is faithful. God is not without effect. And he goes on to say in verse 34, my covenant I will not break. Why? Because it's not a contract like we're familiar with. We understand that when we enter into agreements with one another, that the design or the outline of the contract, that you agree to this, I agree to that, right? And the way I think automatically is, well, if you fail in your obligation, your end of the deal, well, no problem, I'm released from my end. And we think that way all the time. God doesn't work or think that way. When God makes a promise and says, if you do this, you will get this, that promise remains whether you fulfill it or not. God's faithful. He cannot fail. His faithfulness will never fail. The effect of his promises are valid. They still are powerful regardless of whether you avail yourself of the blessing of the oracle or not. Every promise of God will come to pass. Verse 4, he even answers the question. He says, absolutely not. Indeed, let God be true, yet every man a liar. You disagree with what God says, you're a liar. Maybe you've convinced yourself and you're lying to yourself first, and then you're speaking in an absolute confidence, believing that you're right, but the word says you're a liar. You disagree with God, you're lying. The Jewish objector has to admit in the face of this argument that God cannot be unjust, and therefore he is just in judging the Jew in their unrighteousness. You see, the Jew thinks, just like the religious moralist, that because of who they are as a person, that they're going to be saved. It won't work. Doesn't matter who you were born to. Doesn't matter what your identity in this world is. You're going to be judged, everyone. And he says in the second part of verse 4, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and may overcome when you're judged.
You've been listening to Things Above, the radio outreach of Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. Pastor John Durante is our teacher. If you'd like to have a CD copy of the message you heard today, contact us for all the ordering details at thingsaboveradio.com or call us 732-892-4648. Again, 732-892-4648. Here's our mailing address, P.O. Box 1322, Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, 08742. And please remember, it's through your generous gifts that we're able to come to you on this station. When you support this radio ministry this month with a financial investment, we'll donate 50% to Rain Ministries. Hank and Jackie Dahl have been blessed to serve the Lord in youth ministry through various capacities, whether as a youth pastor, Young Life staff members, and now with Rain Ministries and their Royal Servants Division. Again, to support this radio ministry, go to thingsaboveradio.com and click the online giving button. Also at our website, you can listen to a huge archive of Pastor John's messages. And again, you'll find us on the web at thingsaboveradio.com. If you're looking for a church home in the Jersey Shore area, we'd lovingly invite you to come worship with us. Saturday nights at 6:30 and Sunday mornings at 9 and 10:45. We also offer a Spanish language service every Saturday afternoon at 5. Then there's our midweek Bible study on Wednesday evenings at 6:30. The church is located at 708 McLean Avenue in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. For directions or more information, go to thingsaboveradio.com or call us 732-892-4648. Pastor John would love to hear from you. Let him know what you think of this radio ministry at thingsaboveradio@gmail.com. Thanks again for being with us today, and please join us next week as our series in the awesome book of Romans continues, here on Things Above with Pastor John Durante.